The freezing mud of the Whispering Vales clung to her torn dress. She was carrying the next alpha, yet her mate had just cast her out for a wealthier bride. Left to freeze, she didn't know the most feared king in the realm was hunting in these very woods. The air inside the healer's stone hut was thick with the scent of dried rosemary, wood smoke, and the undeniable metallic tang of shifting hormones. Genevieve Miller sat on the edge of a rough-hewn wooden cot, her hands trembling as they rested against her flat stomach. Across from her, the old village midwife, a grizzled she-wolf named Martha, wiped her hands on a linen apron and offered a solemn nod. The ancient rites of blood and moonwater did not lie. Genevieve was with child. In the brutal, unrelenting medieval hierarchy of the Iron Ridge Pack, a pregnancy was a matter of state, especially when the father was Cedric Bolton. Cedric was the alpha heir, a warrior whose broad shoulders carried the weight of a dying bloodline. Genevieve, however, was merely a delta, a tracker's daughter, with no dowry, no political leverage, and no noble blood. But the moon goddess had paired them. They were fated mates, bound by a primal magic that defied the strict social classes of the 12th century. For 6 months, they had met in secret beneath the shadows of the castle's outer walls, whispering promises of a future where Cedric would claim her publicly, defying his father's demands for a strategic marriage. Tonight was the winter solstice feast, the night Cedric had promised to finally announce their union to the pack. Armed with the miraculous news of an heir, Genevieve felt an intoxicating surge of hope. She wrapped her threadbare woolen cloak tightly around her shoulders, bracing herself against the bitter, biting wind that swept down from the northern peaks. The walk to the Bolton stronghold was treacherous. The cobblestones were slick with black ice, and the towering iron gates loomed like the jaws of a great beast. As Genevieve slipped through the servants' entrance and made her way toward the great hall, the sounds of raucous laughter, clashing tankards, and lute music echoed through the drafty stone corridors. The air grew warm, heavy with the suffocating odors of roasted boar, spilled mead, and the sweat of 100 shifting wolves. Genevieve slipped into the back of the hall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stood on the tips of her toes, straining to see the high table. There sat Cedric. He was dressed in a tunic of rich crimson velvet, a heavy fur mantle draped over his shoulders, looking every bit the fierce, untouchable lord he was destined to become. But as Genevieve's eyes adjusted to the flickering torchlight, her stomach plummeted. He was not alone. Seated beside him, her hand resting intimately on his forearm, was Beatrice Wyatt. Beatrice was the daughter of the wealthiest alpha in the neighboring valleys. She was draped in imported silks and heavy gold jewelry, her golden hair perfectly braided, her smile sharp and triumphant. The Wyatt family controlled the iron mines, the very resource the Iron Ridge Pack desperately needed to survive the encroaching wars. Genevieve took a tentative step forward, the bond in her chest pulsing with a sudden, frantic warning. Cedric's eyes, usually warm and amber when they looked at her in the dark, caught her gaze across the crowded room. They were as cold as the stones beneath her feet. He did not smile. He did not offer a reassuring nod. Instead, his jaw tightened, and he stood, raising a heavy silver goblet to silence the roaring hall. "My people," Cedric's voice boomed, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. The music ceased abruptly. The laughter died. "Tonight we celebrate the turning of the season, but we also celebrate the securing of our future. It is with great honor that I announce my formal mating and the future Luna of the Iron Ridge Pack, Beatrice Wyatt." A deafening cheer erupted from the warriors, but Genevieve couldn't hear it. A high-pitched ringing filled her ears. The room spun. The mate bond, the invisible, sacred tether that connected her soul to Cedric's, began to burn, searing her chest as if she had swallowed glowing coals. Unable to control her instincts, Genevieve pushed past the heavily armed guards and the drunken revelers. "Cedric!" she cried out, her voice cracking, breaking through the celebratory din. The crowd parted, leaving her standing alone in the center of the great hall, a fragile, shivering figure in peasant's wool, confronting the high table. Cedric's face hardened into a mask of cruel pragmatism. "What is the meaning of this disruption?" he demanded, feigning an icy ignorance that cut deeper than any blade. "Cedric, you can't," Genevieve pleaded, tears spilling over her pale cheeks, ignoring the shocked gasps of the nobles. "The bond, our promises, and I have news. Please, let me speak with you in private. There is a child." "Silence," Cedric roared, his alpha command hitting the room like a physical shockwave. Several weaker wolves dropped to their knees, but Genevieve remained standing, anchored by the tiny, impossible life growing inside her. Cedric stepped down from the dais, his boots heavy on the stone floor. He stopped mere inches from her. He smelled of wine, cedar, and the sickeningly sweet perfume of the Wyatt heiress. "You are mistaken, Delta," he whispered, his voice low enough for only her to hear, laced with a venomous ambition. "A lord does not mate with a peasant. I need an army. I need iron. You offer nothing but a liability." "But the goddess does not feed my people in wartime," Cedric snapped. He took a step back, raising his voice for the entire hall to witness. "Genevieve Miller, you stand before this court spewing lies and challenging the authority of your future alpha. For this treason, I strip you of your rank." Genevieve choked on a sob, shaking her head frantically. Cedric's eyes flashed with a monstrous, inhuman gold. He raised his hand, pointing toward the heavy oak doors. "I, Cedric Bolton, future alpha of the Iron Ridge Pack, formally reject you, Genevieve Miller, as my mate. I cast you out of this territory. You are banished. If you are found within our borders by sunrise, you will be hunted down and killed." The rejection snapped the mate bond with the violence of a guillotine. Genevieve screamed a raw, guttural sound of pure agony. Blood dripped from her nose as the spiritual tether was violently severed, sending her crashing to the cold stone floor. She clutched her stomach, gasping for air that wouldn't come. "Throw her out," Cedric commanded, turning his back on her agonizing writhing, returning to the high table to take Beatrice's hand. Rough hands seized Genevieve by the arms. Two enormous guards dragged her half-conscious body through the hall. She was too weak to fight, too shattered to speak. They hauled her through the courtyard, the freezing winter air shocking her system, and hurled her violently out the gates. She landed hard in the icy mud, scraping her palms and knees. The massive iron gates slammed shut, the heavy deadbolts sliding into place with a terrifying finality. Alone in the pitch-black, freezing night, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a rejected pup in her womb, Genevieve was left to die. The silence of the winter forest was absolute, broken only by the ragged, desperate sound of Genevieve's breathing. The temperature was plunging rapidly, the frost settling over the barren branches of the whispering vales like a shroud of white death. Genevieve forced herself up from the frozen mud outside the gates. To stay still was to invite the long, unending sleep. She stumbled forward into the tree line, moving blindly through the dense, unforgiving wilderness. Every step was an agony. The severing of a mate bond was a trauma few wolves survived. It caused the heart to stutter, the immune system to crash, and the inner wolf to howl in a maddening, suicidal grief. Genevieve's inner wolf was curled into a tight, shivering ball in the recesses of her mind, whimpering over the loss of her mate, utterly broken. But deeper down, a new, ancient instinct was taking over the fierce, unyielding drive of a mother. "Keep moving," a voice whispered in the dark corners of her mind. "For the pup, walk." Hours bled into a terrifying blur of darkness and biting wind. Genevieve's threadbare cloak was entirely useless against the medieval winter. Her leather boots soaked through, her toes turning numb, then painfully burning, before losing all sensation entirely. Frost clung to her eyelashes and her hair, turning her into a ghostly figure wandering through a graveyard of towering pine trees. By what she guessed was the 3rd hour past midnight, her strength finally gave out. Her knees buckled, sending her crashing through the thick crust of snow. She tried to push herself up, but her arms felt like lead. Crawling on her hands and knees, she managed to drag herself beneath the massive, sprawling roots of an ancient, overturned oak tree. It formed a small, shallow cave, offering a meager shield from the relentless wind. Genevieve curled into a tight fetal position, wrapping her arms protectively over her stomach. She closed her eyes, the edges of her vision turning a dark, comforting gray. The pain in her chest from Cedric's betrayal began to numb, replaced by a dangerous, warm lethargy. She knew what this was. It was the final stage of freezing to death. She murmured a silent prayer to the moon goddess, begging for the soul of her unborn child, and let the darkness begin to pull her under. Snop. The sound of a heavy branch breaking echoed like a gunshot in the still air. Genevieve's eyes flew open. The lethargy vanished, replaced by a spike of pure adrenaline. She held her breath, listening. Crunch, crunch. Heavy footsteps were moving through the snow, pacing deliberately toward her hollow. The wind shifted, bringing with it a foul, rotting stench, the unmistakable scent of a rogue wolf. Driven mad by isolation, rogues were savage, unpredictable, and fiercely territorial. To a starving rogue, a weakened, injured female was nothing more than easy prey. Genevieve pressed her back hard against the frozen dirt, her hands searching frantically for a rock, a sharp stick, anything. She found a jagged piece of deadwood and gripped it with trembling, frostbitten fingers. A massive, shadowy figure detached itself from the darkness. The rogue was monstrous, its fur matted with filth and dried blood, its yellow eyes locked onto the hollow beneath the roots. It let out a low, rattling growl, saliva dripping from its exposed fangs. It dropped onto all fours, preparing to lunge. Genevieve raised her makeshift weapon, baring her teeth in a final, desperate act of defiance. But the rogue never made the jump. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the forest changed. The air grew incredibly heavy, as if the atmospheric pressure had doubled in a fraction of a second. The rogue froze, its yellow eyes widening in sudden, absolute terror. It whimpered, taking a frantic step backward, the hair on its spine standing straight up in submission. Before Genevieve could comprehend what was happening, a massive blur of movement erupted from the tree line. A dire wolf, entirely black and the size of a warhorse, slammed into the rogue with the force of a battering ram. There was a sickening crunch of bone, a single, abruptly cut-off yelp, and then silence. The giant black wolf stood over the broken body of the rogue, its chest heaving, its eyes glowing with a terrifying, piercing crimson light. Genevieve shrank back, dropping her stick. She recognized that eye color. She recognized the sheer, suffocating aura of dominance that radiated from the beast, an aura that made every cell in her body scream to submit. This was no ordinary alpha. This was the Alpha King. For a moment, the great beast stood still, tasting the air. Then, his massive head snapped toward the hollow beneath the oak roots. He took a step forward, his enormous paws completely silent on the snow. As he approached, the wolf's form began to blur and shift, the sound of breaking bones and reforming muscle echoing in the quiet clearing. Where the monstrous wolf had stood, a man now emerged. He was towering, heavily muscled, and covered in intricate, tribal scars that spoke of 100 brutal wars. He wore thick leather breeches and a heavy, fur-lined cloak that he pulled swiftly over his broad shoulders. His face was a mask of rugged, aristocratic cruelty, framed by dark hair and a crown of braided iron and bone that rested on his brow. This was Alistair Montgomery, the Lichen King of the Northern Reaches. A man rumored to be as cold and unforgiving as the mountains he ruled. Alistair crouched slowly before the hollow, his crimson eyes locking onto Genevieve's terrified face. She was trembling so violently her teeth chattered, her lips tinted a dangerous shade of blue. The king did not speak immediately. He leaned in closer, his senses taking her in. He smelled the dirt, the freezing blood from her nose, the scent of the Iron Ridge pack. He smelled the violent, agonizing stench of a forcibly severed mate bond. His jaw clenched in disgust at the cruelty of it. But then, he inhaled deeper, and his crimson eyes flared wide with shock. He smelled the faint, pure scent of an unborn pup. "Who did this to you?" Alistair's voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in Genevieve's chest. It was a voice used to commanding armies, not comforting the dying. Genevieve's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her strength was finally, entirely gone. Her eyes rolled back, and she slumped sideways into the snow. With a speed that belied his massive size, Alistair lunged forward, catching her before her head hit the frozen ground. He cursed under his breath in an ancient dialect, feeling the dangerous ice-cold temperature of her skin. Without a moment's hesitation, the king of the northern reaches unfastened his heavy, enchanted bearskin cloak. He wrapped it tightly around the unconscious, rejected peasant girl, lifting her effortlessly into his arms against his burning, unnatural body heat. He looked down at her pale, tear-stained face, an unfamiliar, ferocious protectiveness awakening in his chest. Cedric Bolton had discarded her like trash in the dirt, completely unaware that he had just handed the Alpha King the one thing he had spent a century searching for. Genevieve awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of absolute, encompassing warmth. For a disorienting moment, her mind scrambled to piece together her reality. The last thing she remembered was the biting, lethal frost of the Whispering Vales, the horrifying visage of a rogue wolf, and then the overwhelming, suffocating presence of crimson eyes. She gasped, sitting bolt upright. The sudden movement sent a dull ache through her chest where the severed mate bond still throbbed like a phantom limb, but the sharp, agonizing pain was gone. She was no longer in the freezing mud. She was buried beneath layers of heavy, down-filled velvet quilts, resting on a mattress so soft it felt like spun cloud. The room around her was cavernous and magnificent, a stark contrast to the drafty wooden huts of the Iron Ridge Pack. The walls were constructed of massive, dark stone blocks, illuminated by the roaring fire in a grand hearth carved from black marble. Tapestries depicting ancient wolf lore hung from the rafters, and the air smelled of burning pine, roasted meats, and a sharp, clean scent of snow and cedar that made her inner wolf stir with an uncharacteristic curiosity. "You should not move so quickly, little one." Genevieve flinched, pulling the heavy quilts up to her chin. In the corner of the room, bathed in the soft glow of a tallow candle, sat a man in a crisp linen tunic. He was older, with silver hair tied back with a leather cord and spectacles resting on his nose. He carried an air of clinical calm, holding a mortar and pestle. "I am Thomas Eris," he said, his voice gentle, "chief healer to the royal court. You are within the walls of Winterbourne Citadel, and before panic sets in, allow me to assure you, you are perfectly safe, and the child is unharmed." Genevieve's hands flew to her flat stomach. A ragged sob of sheer relief tore from her throat. "My baby, it survived the cold?" "It survived the cold, the shock of a severed mate bond, and the physical trauma of your banishment," Thomas replied, setting his tools down and approaching her bedside with a chalice of warm herbal broth. "It is nothing short of a miracle. Or, perhaps, a testament to the sheer will of its mother. Drink this. It contains willow bark for the pain and motherwort to steady your heart." Genevieve took the chalice with trembling hands. "How did I get here?" Before Thomas could answer, the heavy oak doors of the bedchamber groaned open. The temperature in the room seemed to spike, the very air growing dense and charged with an immense primal authority. Alistair Montgomery stepped into the light. Genevieve shrank back against the headboard. In the light of the hearth, the Lichen King was even more terrifyingly magnificent than he had been in the dark woods. He wore a simple tunic of dark leather and wool, but no clothing could mask the sheer power coiled within his massive frame. His crimson eyes swept over her, calculating, intense, and utterly unreadable. "Leave us, Thomas," Alistair commanded. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. The healer bowed deeply. "Yes, Your Majesty." The door clicked shut, leaving Genevieve alone with the most dangerous predator in the realm. Alistair approached the foot of the bed, his movements predatory and silent. He did not look at her with the disdain she was accustomed to receiving from high-ranking wolves. Instead, he looked at her as if she were a puzzle he was determined to solve. "Your name," the king demanded, though it sounded more like a request than an order. "Genevieve," she whispered, her throat dry. "Genevieve Miller. A Delta," he noted, tilting his head. "Yet you carry an Alpha's heir." "I smelled the Bolton bloodline on the child. Cedric Bolton claimed you, bred you, and then tossed you to the winter when a wealthier bride presented herself. Is this correct?" Genevieve nodded, the shame of her rejection burning her cheeks. "He needed the Wyatt family's iron. He said I was a liability." A dark, dangerous laugh escaped Alistair's chest. It was a sound entirely devoid of humor. "Cedric Bolton is a fool playing at being a lord. He trades his bloodline for rocks in the dirt. But there is something he missed, Genevieve Miller. Something quite extraordinary." He stepped closer, resting his large, heavily scarred hands on the wooden footboard. "When I carried you through the snow, my inner beast, a creature that has not known peace in over a century, settled. It did not just tolerate your presence, it fiercely demanded your protection. And more than that," Alistair's crimson eyes flashed. "Your child. The severed bond should have killed it instantly. Instead, the pup's aura is drawing upon the latent magic in this very citadel to sustain itself. You do not just carry a Bolton heir, Genevieve. You carry a dormant, ancient bloodline. Your peasant lineage hides something entirely different." Genevieve stared at him, bewildered. "My parents were trackers. We have no ancient blood. History is written by the victors, and bloodlines are easily hidden to protect the hunted," Alistair said smoothly. "But that is a mystery for another day. Right now, you are a packless female with a royal bounty on your head. Cedric decreed that if you are found, you will be killed. I have a different decree. The king stood tall, the full weight of his royal aura filling the room. You will remain at Winterbourne. You will be placed under the direct protection of the crown. You will eat from my table, and my royal guard will shadow your every step. No harm will come to you, or the child you carry, so long as you draw breath within my territory. Tears welled in Genevieve's eyes. She was a discarded delta, a broken, rejected mate. Why would the most ruthless king in history offer her such grace? Why are you doing this, Your Majesty? Alistair held her gaze, a strange, profound softening appearing in his terrifying eyes. Because, Genevieve, for the first time in 100 years, the moon goddess has given me a reason to protect rather than destroy. Rest now. Tomorrow your new life begins. 300 miles to the south, the stronghold of the Iron Ridge Pack was suffocating under a blanket of paranoid tension. The grand promises Cedric Bolton had made on the night of the winter solstice were rapidly disintegrating into a bitter, freezing reality. In the Alpha's war room, Cedric stood over a massive parchment map, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ground together. Beside him stood Beatrice Wyatt, draped in a heavy cloak of white fox fur, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. The glow of their mating ceremony had faded, replaced by the harsh, unrelenting pressures of medieval pack politics. The iron shipments from your father's mines have stopped, Beatrice, Cedric snapped, slamming his fist onto the heavy oak table. You assured me the Wyatt forces would supply us through the spring. My warriors are fighting border skirmishes with rusted blades. And you assured me that mating you would elevate my family's status, Beatrice fired back, her voice shrill, echoing off the stone walls. Instead, I am bound to an alpha whose pack is starving. The eastern trade routes have been entirely blockaded by the Lycan King's patrols. Nobody wants to do business with Iron Ridge right now, Cedric. Not since. She trailed off, her eyes narrowing. Not since what? Cedric growled. Lord Richard of the Vale, a senior council member with a face like weathered leather, stepped forward from the shadows. Not since rumors began to spread, Alpha. Rumors regarding the manner in which you secured your new bride. Cedric's amber eyes flashed with a dangerous warning. Watch your tongue, Richard. I did what was necessary for the survival of this pack. I banished a useless delta. You cast out your fated mate while she carried your pup, Richard corrected, his tone completely devoid of fear. The pack feels it, Cedric. The spiritual balance of Iron Ridge is fractured. The crops in the lower valleys died of frost overnight. The wolves are restless. They believe the moon goddess has cursed us for your arrogance. Superstitious garbage, Cedric spat, though a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He had felt the shift, too. Since the night he severed the bond with Genevieve, his own inner wolf had grown sluggish, uncooperative, and plagued by agonizing night terrors. Genevieve is dead. She would not have survived an hour in the Whispering Vales. The past is buried. Perhaps, Richard murmured, sliding a sealed parchment across the war table. It bore the heavy wax seal of a dire wolf, the royal crest of King Alistair Montgomery. But the present demands your attention. A royal courier arrived this morning. The Lycan King is hosting a grand conclave at Winterbourne Citadel at the next full moon. He commands the presence of all regional alphas to negotiate the new border treaties. Cedric stared at the wax seal as if it were a venomous snake. King Alistair rarely involved himself in regional squabbles, unless he was preparing to slaughter a pack and absorb its territory. We cannot afford to refuse a royal summons, Cedric muttered, a sickening realization dawning on him. We must go to Winterbourne, and we must beg the king to lift the trade blockades. Meanwhile, at Winterbourne Citadel, Genevieve was utterly unaware of the political storm brewing in the south. Her recovery over the past month had been nothing short of miraculous. Under the expert care of Thomas Eris and the constant, overwhelming influx of nutrient-rich foods, her frail frame had filled out. The hollowness in her cheeks vanished, replaced by a healthy, vibrant flush, and her stomach now held the unmistakable, rounded curve of a healthy pregnancy. But the most shocking transformation was spiritual. The severed mate bond, which should have left her a hollow, broken shell, had miraculously begun to heal, and she knew exactly why. She stood on the high balcony of her chambers, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, watching the royal guards run combat drills in the snowy courtyard below. Among them stood Alistair, He was shirtless despite the freezing temperatures, his heavily scarred torso gleaming with sweat as he effortlessly sparred with 3 elite warriors simultaneously. Every time Alistair was near, Genevieve felt a strange magnetic pull. It wasn't the frantic teenage urgency she had felt with Cedric. This was something deeper, older, and infinitely more profound. It was a slow-burning fire that wrapped around her soul, offering absolute safety and unyielding strength. Suddenly, Alistair paused mid-strike. Without looking up, he knew she was there. He dismissed his guards with a wave of his hand and looked up at the balcony, his crimson eyes locking onto hers with a burning intensity that made her breath hitch. He moved with supernatural speed, disappearing from the courtyard and appearing in her chambers mere seconds later. He stepped onto the balcony, his body radiating a massive amount of heat that immediately warmed the freezing air around her. "You should not be out in the cold, Genevieve," Alistair said gently, reaching out to pull the shawl tighter around her shoulders. His knuckles brushed against her neck, sending a jolt of pure electricity straight down to her toes. "I was watching you," she admitted, her voice soft. "You train harder than any alpha I have ever seen." "I have more to protect now," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her rounded stomach. Gently, with a reverence she had never experienced, the Alpha King placed his large, calloused hand over her womb. Instantly the pup kicked. Alistair's eyes widened, a rare, breathtaking smile breaking across his rugged face. Strong. The child absorbs the ambient energy of this citadel. It is thriving. Genevieve looked up at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Alistair, Thomas told me about the conclave. He said alphas from all over the realm are arriving next week." She swallowed hard. "Cedric is coming." Alistair's smile vanished, replaced by a terrifying, cold resolve. His hand moved from her stomach to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. "Let him come," the king whispered, his crimson eyes flashing with lethal promise. "Let Cedric Bolton walk into my hall. Let him see the magnificent queen he threw into the mud, and when he realizes what he has lost, I will enjoy watching him break." The great hall of Winterbourne Citadel was a masterpiece of lethal grandeur. Towering pillars of black basalt stretched toward a vaulted ceiling lost in shadows, while hundreds of iron braziers cast a flickering, golden light over the assembled nobility. Alphas from every corner of the realm stood shoulder to shoulder, their political rivalries temporarily suspended under the crushing, oppressive dominance of the Lycan King's territory. Near the massive oak doors, Cedric Bolton stood rigid, sweating beneath his heavy velvet mantle. Beside him, Beatrice Wyatt clutched his arm, her usual arrogance entirely evaporated in the presence of true, ancient power. The Iron Ridge pack was failing. Their crops were dead, their borders were besieged by rogues, and their treasury was empty. Cedric needed King Alistair to lift the trade blockades, or his pack would not survive the winter. At the far end of the hall, King Alistair Montgomery sat upon a throne carved from a single massive block of obsidian. He wore a crown of jagged iron, his crimson eyes scanning the crowd with terrifying indifference. To his right stood his chief healer, Thomas Arris, and to his left, the formidable Duke Arthur Cavendish, a legendary war commander and the king's most trusted confidant. "Step forward, Alpha Cedric of Iron Ridge," Duke Cavendish's voice boomed, silencing the murmurs of the gathered lords. Cedric swallowed the thick knot of dread in his throat and marched down the center aisle, Beatrice hurrying to keep pace. When they reached the base of the dais, Cedric forced himself to bow, though his pride rebelled against the submission. "Your Majesty," Cedric began, his voice strained, "I come before you to pledge the continued loyalty of Iron Ridge and to humbly request the reopening of the eastern trade routes. Our people are suffering. We seek your royal mercy." Alistair leaned forward, resting his chin on his scarred fist. His crimson eyes bore into Cedric, peeling back layers of the young Alpha's arrogance to expose the cowardice beneath. "Mercy," the king repeated, the word rolling off his tongue like a curse. "You speak of mercy, Cedric Bolton. Yet I wonder how much mercy you have shown to those under your own protection." Cedric's heart hammered against his ribs. "I do not understand, Your Grace. I have done everything to secure the future of my pack." "Have you?" Alistair's voice dropped to a lethal whisper that somehow echoed through the cavernous hall. "Let us ask the future of your pack what she thinks of your leadership." The king extended his hand toward the heavy velvet curtains behind the throne. The hall held its collective breath as the fabric parted. Out stepped Genevieve. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of assembled wolves. Cedric stumbled backward, the blood draining completely from his face. Beatrice let out a muffled shriek, clapping a hand over her mouth. Genevieve was no longer the shivering, mud-soaked Delta they had discarded in the freezing woods. She was draped in a breathtaking gown of midnight blue silk, embroidered with silver threads that caught the firelight. Her hair cascaded in thick, shining waves over her shoulders, framing a face that radiated health, undeniable power, and absolute serenity. But the most glaring detail was the prominent, rounded curve of her pregnancy, proudly displayed beneath the royal silk. "Genevieve?" Cedric choked out, his mind fracturing. "No, you're dead. The winter, the rogues." "I survived, Cedric," Genevieve said, her voice steady and clear, ringing with an authority she had never possessed in Iron Ridge. "No thanks to you." Cedric's shock rapidly morphed into a desperate, frantic greed. If she was alive, and carrying his child, he still had a claim to a royal heir. "Your Majesty," Cedric shouted, taking a bold, foolish step toward the dais. "This female is a runaway from my territory. She carries my bloodline. I demand her immediate return to Iron Ridge." Alistair did not shout. He did not move abruptly. But the sheer force of his alpha aura slammed into the hall like a physical avalanche. Several alphas dropped to their knees, gasping for breath. Cedric was forced down, his knees cracking painfully against the stone floor, his nose bleeding from the atmospheric pressure. "You demand nothing," Alistair rumbled, standing from his throne and descending the stone steps, moving to stand protectively at Genevieve's side. He wrapped a massive, scarred arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. "You discarded her because you believed her to be a peasant," Alistair continued, his voice dripping with venom, "because your pathetic, narrow vision could only see the iron in Beatrice Wyatt's mines. But you are a fool, Cedric. Duke Cavendish," read the royal registry. Duke Arthur Cavendish unrolled an ancient, crumbling parchment, clearing his throat. By the blood rights of the First Lycan Wars, it is documented that the royal Cavendish Lycan bloodline was hidden among the trackers of the southern valleys to protect them from extinction. Genevieve Miller is no Delta. She is the last living descendant of the original Lycan queens. Cedric's jaw dropped. The hall erupted into frantic whispers. "But the child is mine," Cedric pleaded, pointing a trembling finger at Genevieve's stomach. "The mate bond." "Was an anomaly?" Genevieve interrupted, touching the side of her neck. She pulled back her hair to reveal a fresh, glowing mark, the unmistakable, jagged bite of a Lycan king. "The bond you felt was the moon goddess forcing a path. She tied me to you just long enough for you to banish me into the Whispering Vales. She used your cruelty to bring me exactly where I belonged." Alistair looked down at Genevieve, his crimson eyes softening with a profound, earth-shattering devotion. "She is my fated mate, my true queen, and the child she carries is sustained not by your weak blood, but by the ancient magic of Winterborn. It is my heir now." Cedric scrambled on the floor, looking around for support, but even Lord Richard of the Vale had turned his back, kneeling in submission to the new queen. Beatrice Wyatt ripped her arm away from Cedric, realizing she had tied herself to a doomed man. "Cedric Bolton," King Alistair decreed, his voice ringing with finality. "For the crime of treason against the royal bloodline and the attempted murder of my queen, I strip you of your alpha title. Iron Ridge is hereby absorbed into the crown's territory. You are banished from these lands. If you are found within my borders by sunrise, you will be hunted down and killed." The exact words Cedric had used against her now sealed his own fate. Guards seized the screaming, broken Cedric, dragging him toward the heavy oak doors, casting him out into the freezing night, alone and packless. Genevieve leaned her head against Alistair's chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. The winter outside was bitter, but within the walls of Winterborn, the true Lycan queen had finally come home. From a rejected, freezing outcast left to die in the mud, to the most powerful and revered Lycan queen in history, Genevieve's story proves that the moon goddess's plans are always greater than a cruel alpha's betrayal. Cedric lost everything, while the Alpha King found the family he had waited a century to protect. If you loved this dramatic tale of revenge, true mates, and royal destiny, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible werewolf stories.